Hey, showing up at the start as one of the many, many things required by the YouTube algorithm now. Anyways, it's time for the monthly update on oil production levels. PayPal and Patreon links and the YouTube Super Whatever button is all down below if you want to support me. I'll do so if you actually can. And as always, you can get any of the graphs used in this video for free through the drive folder linked in the description. So going down the list and rolling both non-OPEC and OPEC countries into one video this time, starting with a former OPEC member, Angola, who peaked a while ago up at about 2 million barrels per day, has declined since then down close to 1, but has been adding just enough modestly sized fields offshore to keep themselves from going under 1. And over the past few months has actually climbed back up to now 1.11 million barrels per day. Azerbaijan, halfway down from where they peaked a decade and a half ago or 2 decades ago at 1.1. They've declined down now to around 550,000 barrels per day, this time coming in at 551. Argentina peaked conventionally up in the 800s, declined down to about 400. Until the late 2010s, they started fracking in the Vaca Muerta shale, which has now carried them up to, as of the halfway point of this year, about 910,000 barrels per day. Australia was also once up at 800, but they've declined down into now the mid 200s, and most recently came in at about 240,000 barrels per day of production. Algeria peaked at 1.4 and had declined down close to 1 before the semi-eternal production cuts, and they've restored their production close back up to 1, and it is looking like they're going to come up capability-wise just short of it, as once they hit the 970s, they really slowed down and have only just managed to get back up over 980 now at 982,000 barrels per day. Brazil continues climbing, adding further expansions and new fields offshore, and last month was at 4.3. Now they have gone up a further 40,000 up to a new high of 4.34 million barrels per day. Canada slowly now climbing up through the fives, heading towards a likely peak or plateau close to 6. Although if they do finally start expanding into some of their offshore stuff in the east, like it looks like they might be intending to, then they might actually be able to push above 6, depending on how heavily they go into that. But they had been up to 5.3, dropped back down just under 5 when some wildfires threatened a few fields and they had to shut down some stuff. But those are back online, and now they're back up to a flat 5.3 million barrels per day. China continuing to hold on in the lower 4s, coming in at 4.4 this time. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption in present day is usually around 17. The smaller of the two Congos, the one that's actually politically stable and the one that has oil instead of all the world's cobalt, peaked close up to 400,000 and was down to around 250, but some new field additions recently in some of their last remaining untouched offshore areas, as their territory is not that big, have brought them back up close to 300,000, and this time they came in at 286. Colombia, continuing their decline from their second peak of 1 million, are at the same level they were last month, coming in at 735,000 barrels per day. Ecuador peaked and plateaued for a few years at around 550, and they have entered their terminal decline since then and have gradually come down to around 460 now, this time coming in exactly at 460,000 barrels per day. Egypt got close to 1 million a long time ago and has since gradually declined down to around 500,000. In the last few months, they were just under it. Now they're just over 500,000, just over 500,000, coming in at 501,000 barrels per day. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption, their own demand, under actual normal circumstances, was almost up to 1 million themselves. Ghana, over in West Africa, peaked up over 200 and declined down to 150, got some enhanced recovery, and got back up to the 180s. Has since declined down to around 178. However, next year, a new field and another expansion project will be jumping them up close to 300,000. Guyana, over in South America, is up over 900, and they were close to 920, but over the last few months, they've gradually declined down to now 903, as their first two fields are now starting their initial decline phase. But in a few months, they'll be adding yet another field into production that will jump them up over 1.1 million. Gabon has gone up over 300 a few times and got down to 180, added a few new fields, jumped up to 230, and has resumed declining from there. As of this time, they are at 214,000 barrels per day. India was once up close to 800 for a while, but they declined down under 600 until just now, in the last few weeks. A large or medium sized field offshore in their eastern waters was activated and has brought them back up over 600, up to 624, although their domestic consumption under normal circumstances in present day is up at 6 million. Indonesia once held a plateau around 1.6 million barrels per day for a few decades, but that time has long since passed, and they've declined all the way down under 600 now, this time coming in at 576,000 barrels per day. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption, in present day, under normal circumstances at least, is up to around 2.2 million. Iraq, in present day, before the Iran war started and the Strait of Hormuz was shut down, was up to around 4.5 million barrels per day, and next year was going to be jumping up to or over 5. However, as their ability to export was effectively cut off, they had to drop as far down as they could, and they dropped as far down as 1.4 million barrels per day before activating some of their pipelines that go up and out through Turkey, bypassing the strait. And so they're back up to 1.76 million barrels per day of production now, and over the next couple months, another pipeline will be activating that will allow them to bypass another 700,000 to export out through the Mediterranean. So they'll be back up over 2 million in a few months. Iran once produced 6 million barrels per day, was never able to restore that after the revolution, held around 4 for a few decades until all the sanctions stuff, and they cut down to only supplying their own domestic consumption as they were unable to export. And after years of having their fields, or a lot of their fields at least, shut down, they did lose production capacity, as found when they were only able to restore themselves up to about 3.4 million barrels per day, and even started declining from that up until the Iran war started. And after running out of onshore storage under the blockade and then running out of floating storage, they have been curtailing their production down again now to most recently 2.33 million barrels per day. Kuwait normally could hold a 3 million barrel per day plateau. They had only restored themselves up to about 2.6 or 2.7 million barrels per day before all of this started. Since then, however, since they can't export anything, they are down at most recently 578,000. Kazakhstan in the last 2 years has finally gotten over 2 million barrels per day and is now, as of this month, up to 2.26 million barrels per day. Libya gradually working to restore their lost production from all the civil war time. Recently got as high as 1.43. As of this moment, is back down a tiny bit to a flat 1.4 million barrels per day. Malaysia was once up in the 800s. They declined down into the mid 400s, but finally getting some enhanced recovery stuff and some new fields. They have recovered all the way back up to about 550 as of the moment. Mexico, once up over 3.5 million barrels per day decades ago, has since then declined all the way down into the upper ones and has managed to hold off here for the last 5 or 6 or actually more years. Nigeria, capable of holding 2 million barrels per day, slipped all the way down close to 1 because of a wide variety of factors that degraded their capacity. However, they have been restoring things over the last 2 or 3 years and had gotten back up to 1.5. Now, however, they have done another upward restoration lunge to 1.66 or 1.67 million barrels per day. Norway, although not up at their 3.5 million barrel per day North Sea heights, has kept themselves up pretty high as they do have quite a bit of remaining offshore area to work with, the opposite case of the UK, basically. And so they got as low as 1.5. They added stuff over the last decade plus that has taken them back up over 2, this time coming in at 2.16 million barrels per day. Oman doing its part to try to alleviate some of the supply situation, although its spare capacity was never that large. But they can cap out at about 1.3 is the expectation, and they were holding around a flat 1 million up until all this started. So they have been trying to turn things upwards as fast as they can. And as of the middle of the year now, it looks like they're up to either 1.08 or 1.09. Qatar, the peninsula nation in the Persian Gulf, had gotten as high as 1.5 or so after leaving OPEC, like many members have, because they were tired of constantly being under constraints. Although they were holding off around 1.3 for a little bit, but just before this started, entered they had entered a renewed decline and were probably going to drop down towards 1.2. However, because of the current situation, they are now all the way down to only 290,000 barrels per day. Russia was getting close to 11 million barrels per day, and probably would have most of the expectations were they would peak up in the upper 11s around 2025 or this year. However, after starting the Ukraine war, they had to curtail production because of customer absence. And then, as the years went by, after all of the outside oil majors had left, who had done the restoration of their oil production post Soviet collapse, things have begun to fall apart over time, and they had dropped down to 9. However, after that, they declared their production data classified and haven't actually given official things anymore. So they were declining further on their own and were down to around 8.7. However, then the massive oil and gas infrastructure attack campaign by Ukraine started and has been going on for months. It has seen them it has seen Russia now, because of damage, forced to drop all the way down to, at one point, most likely 8.2. Again, can't get an exact figure because everything's being obscured. However, they have restored a bit since then, about 100,000 supposedly. So that would have them back up to 8.3 million barrels per day as of the moment. Saudi Arabia, normally holding a 10 million barrel per day plateau, and would run out of that capability to do so around 2032 or 2033. Now, definitely into 2033, as their production is way down because of these circumstances. They, however, do have the east to west pipeline that allows them to export a decent amount through the Red Sea. For info on that and a whole bunch of other pipelines, those that already exist and those that are under construction, see the video linked in the corner. They're able currently to still export 5 million barrels per day via the Red Sea, and most recently had a production level of 7 million barrels per day. The US is on their peak or plateau, been at this point for around 2 years now, and have touched 13.8 4 separate times now, constantly now repeating a pattern of hitting 13.8, then declining down a few 100,000, or then jumping back up as either a large or multiple large new fields start production offshore in the Gulf, or projects start up home where I used to live in Alaska. And in this case, it was down to 13.65 or 13.66. However, two new things started up at the same time over the last month and a half: a 80,000 barrel per day project back up home in Alaska, and a 180,000 barrel per day field offshore. The UK, once up around 3, back at the height of their North Sea production, is all the way down in the 600s now. This time coming in around 670,000. The UAE was taking themselves up to a 4 million barrel per day plateau, which is the level they wanted to be at. However, because of current circumstances, they've had to curtail down to only supplying their own consumption, along with whatever they can export via their Fujairah airport, which is outside of the Persian Gulf, because they also have a diversion pipeline. And so their current production level is around 2.1 million barrels per day. And last on the list for this time, Venezuela is now seeing its production increase more rapidly, as after the 24-hour US Venezuela war earlier this year, outside oil industries are now back in the country, and are restoring things more quickly than they were being done so previously. But over the last 2 months, they've jumped from 1.1 back up to now 1.25 million barrels per day. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal, Patreon, YouTube, Super, whatever buttons are all down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. You can get all these graphs and plenty more through the Drive folder linked in the description. That's all free to access at any time. There's a link to my Catch channel in the top pinned comment. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.